Of the Women Writing Intentionally show with Jenny Alberti and Tracey Rampling Brown. As you can see, Jenny is still away on holidays, so she's not here with us today, and I am joined by the beautiful Ruth Fae. We are going to be talking all things writing and publishing, from insider secrets to our own author journeys. So Ruth is specifically here to discuss with us today the importance of developmental editing and how working with a book coach can help your manuscript to sparkle. So Ruth is an author, she is an editor, and she's an intuitive writing coach who helps women to tell their stories and speak their authentic truth. Through her years as a journalist and copywriter, Ruth has learned that the true magic of storytelling is to heal, nurture, and create connection. Her focus is to share the wisdom of our individual and collective experiences. A believer in the unlimited potential of co-creation, Ruth works energetically with her clients to break through their writing blocks and help them capture their own magic. She is a columnist, a reviewer and editor for Dance Writer Australia, and has also had several years of experience as a journalist with the youth magazine Indigo. So Ruth has a lot of experience in publishing, both from a journalism perspective, but also from a writing and publishing perspective. And we are so excited to have her here with us on the show this week, and also to announce that Ruth is actually coming on board as our chief editor for the upcoming Wounded Women series that Jenny and I are launching through the Women Writing Intentionally Collective. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Ruth. I would love if you would actually just perhaps give everybody a little bit more background about you and, you know, what excited you about stepping into editing specifically?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Tracey, and Jenny on holidays. It's lovely to be here. My editing journey, it's one of those, I guess, universe-related things. I've written for as long as I could remember, even as a little kid was making books and drawing terrible pictures because I'm so not a drawer, but writing stories and, stapling the books together and making my family read them and all that sort of stuff. So I've written forever and ever and ever. And, through primary and high school, but then, life takes you on a different path. And after leaving high school, I traveled and worked in retail and kind of, went down a different direction, I guess. But on coming back from my travels, I ended up actually working for a bank, funnily enough, which again, so not me. Finances are not my thing. Well, that was a good experience, but came back broke from overseas and went, I need a job, and managed to get one through a friend. But then left that to have my first child, and when he was about 1, I was looking into my husband had started his own business, and I was looking into what I could do, and I started doing an editing and proofreading course, which was kind of my first foray into it. And it was, really specific markups and lots and lots of information. It was really cool. But we're talking 19 years ago now. And then again, wandered off in a different direction, had more babies, volunteered a lot. Didn't really do anything with it until I started working with Indigo magazine, which I don't know, maybe that was, can't remember now, maybe 5-10 years later. And although I started just writing a column, I ended up being like one of their lead journalists, I guess, which was an amazing experience working with girls between the age of 10 to 14. But because we were a small team, there was a lot of self-editing involved, and then collaboration with the 2 editors that we had. And it rekindled that love that I had for not only writing, but also helping other people who write express things the way that they want to, and submit polished pieces of work and create work that the reader wants to read, and it's easy for them to read. And through that experience and my experiences since then, what I have learned is what comes quite naturally to me is writing to an audience. So I could take a piece of work that, say, you've written, Jenny, And if that needs to be edited for 5-year-olds or for 65-year-olds, my brain thankfully works in the way where I can do that. Like I edit from the perspective of the reader, not necessarily from the author. It's important, obviously, to keep the author's story and the author's voice, and stay true to that. But the important thing is that you can write as much as you want, but if someone doesn't read it, or it's difficult to read, or it doesn't resonate or flow, they're not going to gain anything from it. They're potentially not going to finish it. And in this day and age, and this is where I guess the copywriting, my last 10 years working as a copywriter, where that has come into it is particularly with online copy, people read it so quickly. They scroll on their phones, they're whizzing through, they're only picking up headings. So honing a message, if someone's writing a blog or a website or whatever, honing that person's message so the important points and who they are comes across to their clients or potential clients is really important. So I guess for me, putting that the journalist side of things and the editing and proofreading, and my kids do tend to call me a bit of a grammar freak. They have some words that are not necessarily as kind, but again, it's a gift. Like I can look at work and see where there are spelling mistakes or see where things could be worded differently. And to be honest, when I was younger, I thought everyone could do that. And it did take me a while to realize that it is actually a gift that I have, and therefore something that I can bring to help other people share their stories or their message, whether it's through business or books or storytelling or whatever. So now it's everything has aligned. It's been a 20-year journey, I guess, but probably longer, but everything has aligned, and I'm really enjoying working as an editor. I so appreciate you and Jenny for having me on board. But yeah, it's been a journey, but and through my business I've done lots of work with lots of different people, and now it has come to a point where focusing on editing and helping people tell their stories is what matters the most, and it makes my heart happy. So
yeah, I loved so much when you were just saying about how it's really important to write from the perspective of the reader and the target reader, because the thing is that as writers, it is so important for us to share our stories, but if we're not actually tailoring it to our particular target audience, we risk them completely missing the message that they most need to hear. And
exactly.
I think this is one of the things that people don't always realize about editing in and of itself, is that it's not just as simple as copy editing and line editing. And copy editing and line editing, particularly because we talk a lot about multi-author collaborative books, amongst other things, it's very common for most multi-author collaborative books to only do copy editing and line editing. And so I would just love for a second, Ruth, if you could actually perhaps explain for everybody what the differences are between copy editing and line editing, and then we'll touch on what structural and developmental editing is and why that's actually a piece that is so super important.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at traditional publishing houses, they the big name ones, they might have anywhere between 3 to 5 editors that a manuscript goes through. It goes through structural editing, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, proofreading, and there are different people having eyes on the work, which is really important in one way because more eyes picks up more mistakes, or if there's a plot hole in a fiction story and things like that. But when we're working within the multi-author, well, there's two things there. One is that's expensive, and someone who is self-publishing or indie publishing, and when it does come to the multi-author books, having 3 to 5 editors is really not an option. And while I can't really speak for the back end of it, I imagine it would be stupidly expensive to be able to go, well, I have this chapter and it needs to go through 3 different people, or 5 different people. And interestingly, it's also not the way that I work. For me, when I read a piece of work, and it doesn't matter if it's 50 words or 5,000 words or more, um, it's about how it flows and the rhythm that's in it, and again, how that message comes across to the author. So when I'm editing, although depending on the size of the piece of work, um, it is taking all of those things into consideration. There is developmental editing and there is copy editing, I guess. So my explanation of copy editing is it's the basics. It's the grammar, punctuation, spelling. That always happens. I think I have a funny ear. Does the it's checking the piece of content for simple errors.
Consistency of tenses.
Yes, consistency of tense, sentence structure, word choice. Are words being repeated really closely together? Clunkiness of sentences. Is there a way to make a really, really long sentence make more sense or be more easily understood if you split it into 2 or 3? Is it a repeat of 3 short sentences where it could be 1 short sentence and 1 longer one? So what else would there be? Continuity, I guess, when you're looking at when someone is telling a story, does the story head off in a different direction? But that's where it heads a bit more into structural stuff. But being aware of that is important. The type of language that's being used in it, does that change as you're going through it? What else would there be?
I think sometimes even things like geographical language differences, for example, the difference between US English and UK English, the differences between colloquialisms that might be very specific to a region where certain words are used that may not necessarily be understandable in foreign contexts.
Yeah. And also quite simple things like if someone puts a quote in, there's every chance that could be misquoted because a lot of quotes are misquoted. So it's checking things like factual things like that. Like, did Gandhi actually say what you said that they said, or does it need to be or
oh my
Oprah,
goodness.
like whoever it may be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Misattributing things to the wrong people.
Yep, that as well. And there's, even just in when we talk about copy editing, it's the simpler part of it, but it's actually quite an in-depth process. And there's a lot of, I guess, there's a lot of research involved and checking, and also in that, while it may be necessary to change some words or the way that a sentence is written, it's also still important to keep the author's voice through that as well. Well, I believe it is. It's something I'm really conscious of, particularly if someone's sharing their heartfelt stories. It is very important that they feel comfortable with the way that that's portrayed to the reader, because if they feel that they've lost their story because the editor has changed the way that it's written, then that can make them feel yucky, which is no good.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's also, I really just want to, this isn't where I was planning to go with this tonight, but I really just want to touch on just for a second about how there is a difference between preserving an author's voice, as in basically only grammar checking somebody's chapter to preserve their voice in inverted commas, and actually being able to preserve an author's voice even with editing.
Yes. Yeah, it's part of the process. Is so when I get a chapter, for example, I will read through that chapter as it is to get a feel for the person who's writing it and what it is that they want to say and what they want the reader to hear or to learn, or the wisdom that's coming through there. And then it's we haven't really talked about structural, so we'll get to that. But then there is the look at the overall structure of the chapter, and then it is looking at the individual bits and pieces. And for me, that tends to come together, because if I see a typo, I'm going to fix it, because otherwise it will stay in my head and drive me insane.
Mhm.
But yes, their voice, well, in doing that, you do tend to get a feel for the author and their voice. But if the wording of the chapter is clunky or difficult to understand, or their message is obscured in too many flowery words, or it being too descriptive, or it not being descriptive enough, then
Leonie
it's a matter
Dawson
of
likes to call that word salad. When you've got a
yes,
word
yes, that's a
salad.
term we use as well. Yes.
Mhm.
Um, and that's part of being aware of who you're writing to as well. Like, you might be someone who naturally in your everyday life uses big words, and that's part of who you are. And maybe you read a lot or whatever, and you use that. But if you're using words that are particularly technical, or as you said, colloquial, or are just big words, lots of word salad, then there's a very good chance that the reader is not going to get what they need from it, or hear it, or they're going to stop reading, which as an author is the thing you don't want to have happen. You want them to read that opening sentence and then want to read what the paragraph, and then the next paragraph, and then the next paragraph, and go all the way through to the end and have the complete experience. So it is important to maintain their voice, but not at the loss of the piece of work actually being worth reading, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that where you
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect, because the thing is that one of the things that I see is many hybrid indie publishers using preserving the author's voice as a catchphrase for neglecting the editing process. Right?
right?
Like, let's
Yeah.
just whack it through Grammarly, or let's just whack it through Pro
Oh,
Writing Aid
don't.
and
Yeah.
call it edited, right? Like, that's, I
Mm.
mean, that's all you need, right? Anybody
No,
can do that. But
Grammarly and those things are so useful in a way, but the fights that I have had with Grammarly, where I've literally been yelling at my computer, because when we write, Grammarly's running to a set of rules, and when we write, I'm not fluent in other languages, but I can speak about English. It is possible to break those rules, because if
Mhm,
that works with the flow, or it works with the voice, or it works with that particular author, while doing it all the time can be awkward. If we every so often need to start a sentence in a way that is not approved by Grammarly, but it fits with the flow of the storytelling, that's okay.
mhm.
Um, I had a client who particularly wanted me to use Grammarly and check everything, and then when I sent it through, it was copywriting stuff, so it was a bit different. But she would then check it and come back and say, it's not correct. And we'd have these arguments, not nasty ones, but we'd have these arguments about, but it is, because you can bend the rules in English. That's the beauty of writing, is that
Mhm.
you can do that. But
Yeah,
your message still needs to be clear within there as well. So it's a fine line.
absolutely. It is a very fine line, and this is why I think it's really important that we now circle back to what development structural editing
Yes.
is, and why that is actually a huge part of the editing process that is particularly, I guess, neglected or ignored outside of traditional publishing, especially like
Mm,
within indie publishing, like for people who are self-publishing themselves, but also with many hybrid indie publishers ignore developmental editing unless it's for a solo book, perhaps, but they
yeah.
ignore it on collaborative books because of the extra cost, because of the extra time involved, because
Mm.
of the extra handling. But I would love for you to explain a little bit for everyone what developmental editing is and why it is so important.
So developmental editing, which also incorporates structural editing, because to me, they come together, is it's looking for inconsistencies in the text. If the easiest way I think to explain it is, if you imagine a piece of fiction and there might be some really gaping plot holes. But that happens in non-fiction work, and when people are telling their stories, like they do in the multi-author book chapters as well. Um, Particularly if people are jumping on timelines, and it can work, but it depends. It can be boring to, as an author, to write your story that, you know, in 2015 this happened, and then in 2016 this happened, and then blah 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 blah. Um, it it is often nicer to write those life events, not necessarily this happened, this happened, this happened, but if you are writing them in a different order, then there can be mistakes, because as an author, you know what you're writing, but the reader doesn't know your story. So if it's very difficult, if it's difficult for the reader to follow through what's being said, um, then I guess developmental editing is taking the story and restructuring it, looking for inconsistencies, looking for factual errors, looking for contradictions in the text, looking for, it can be as simple as someone having um, the wrong name. Particularly in fiction, you might have a character called Bob, and halfway through the story they change to be Peter. Like, there's things like that that comes into it. The biggest thing for me about it is flow. When you read something, it has to make sense. It has to lead through a story. Like when you're telling a verbal story, there's the ups and the downs and the fast talking and the slower sections, and a chapter in a multi-author book of someone's story about an event or multiple events in their life, they do that too, but the flow overall needs to be there. Copy editing, line editing is the one sentence, one word. Developmental is how the entire chapter looks, how it comes together, having an introduction that leads them through the story, and the conclusion that then ties back into the introduction. So the reader feels that they've got this beautiful container of amazing words and stories and things that they can relate to. Um, and for all to make sense. And if you're, you know, meandering your way or racing your way, depending on what the work is, through this story, and all of a sudden this brick wall comes up, and you're like, hang on a minute, who's that person? Where did they come from? How come we're in Italy now? Because we were in Australia a minute ago. Like, it causes the reader to stop and question and what's going on, and not necessarily stop and question, you know, the stuff you want them to. And it causes discord in the reading process. And the risk is that they're going to stop reading, or they will hop over that wall and continue to the end, but their mind is still back there going, what happened there? I don't understand. What was that bit about? So, and it can be moving entire paragraphs. It can be asking for clarity if there's a couple of sentences that don't lead anywhere. You know, where can this be added in? It can be asking someone to rewrite an introduction or a conclusion so that the two talk to each other and bring the piece of work full circle. So there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot that goes into that.
There is. So there are two things I really want to touch on there. The first one is that I find even within journalism and articles that are written these days, a lot of the articles don't ever have that conclusion that ties back to the introduction. They're missing it. And it's kind of like you get to the bottom of the article and you're like, wait, it just stopped. Like,
Yeah.
are you not going to summarize that? Like, where are the key points? And I always feel like they're so unfinished because obviously the editing team on many of those like those aggregated news websites and whatnot, are not looking for structure and flow. They're not actually pulling the authors up or the contributing writers up and saying, you need to summarize this. Like, you need to have a conclusion here. But the second thing is when you were talking about changing paragraphs around and moving them, that was actually something that happened for me when I wrote my first chapter in Aligned Leaders, which of course Jenny and I talk about Aligned Leaders every week. And it was the first anniversary of Aligned Leaders being released on Saturday. So Jenny and I have both been international best-selling authors for a year now. Yay, us. But so I didn't actually have a developmental editor, but I had some trusted friends, which I've touched on before, who read through my chapter and helped me to restructure some of those things. And I did have, some of them pulled out paragraphs that were near the end and said, bring this to the front, and then you can use that to bring it full circle. Like, this would be a great introductory paragraph, because then you can bring it back to this at the end, or this would fit the flow better if it was in a different place. And it really opened my eyes, especially as a new author at that stage, in terms of writing my own things. I had been ghostwriting for entrepreneurs and other people, but I was usually working with other people's material rather than with my own material. And it was a really good reminder that it is important to continue circling back, and that writing your own story isn't actually any different. I believe this is Amanda, actually. Because Amanda sent me this message, a very similar message, on Facebook, about how in our Lunar Wisdom book, which is being released in 2 weeks, that she loved how her tenses were being cleaned up and the order was changed to make it flow better. So editing does make a difference. And I also want to just touch on here that, to me, having come into publishing from a different perspective than many of the other indie publishers, I felt like developmental and structural editing was actually a really important part of the process. And so my editing team are amazing, and they have done some very significant structural editing for some of the authors, because, and I'll let you touch more on this as well, in terms of how, particularly, I guess I wanted to touch on your book coaching more specifically to do it, but the developmental editing isn't designed to ever make the authors feel inadequate or like their words don't matter or anything like that. And I was very, very conscious of making sure that my Lunar Wisdom girls understood that this was not meant to be a criticism of them, that this was really designed to help showcase them and their words and their stories in the best possible light.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing to remember, and I'm new to multi-author books, but we've talked a lot, and I've talked to some other people involved in the industry as well. If you were to write a fiction book, and whether it went through indie publishing or potentially self-publishing, or whether it went through a traditional place, publishing house, you have beta readers, and you saying that you had some trusted friends who could look through your chapter, that is super important. I worked with a lovely lady who is now a dear friend on her book that was released in February this year, and she and I worked very closely together. She's an amazing writer anyway, but we did work together. I edited her book. And once we had worked together originally, she then sent it to 3 people to have them go through it. And they came back with questions, because you can be too close. As an author, you're already close to your story. As an editor, you get to know every word on that page and every full stop and comma and semicolon, and it's in your head. And to have extra pairs of eyes on it is important. For someone writing a multi-author chapter, while that is potentially possible, and it's great if, as an author, you can send that to your sister or whoever, some friends that you want to have a look at it, that's awesome. But sometimes there isn't the time for that. Sometimes people don't have those connections. Sometimes people don't want to share. They're happy to share within the container of the book and have it go out into the world, but they don't. It's scary to write your story and share your things with the world, and your thoughts and your deepest desires and all of those things. And that's where, as an editor, I believe that that's my role. It's to be a beta reader. It's to it is to look at the structural things. It is to look at the bits and pieces and the nitty gritty and the full stops and commas and all the rest of it. But it is also, as you said, to not necessarily hold their hand, but to provide kind and caring advice. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know how to write, and I know how to edit, and I know how to work with people. I think I do that quite well. But there are many, many other things in the world. I don't know how to be a makeup artist. My daughter is 12. She's bloody amazing. She learned all sorts of things, lovely TikTok over COVID. Um, and she's 12, and I now will defer to her. Love, how do I put my makeup on? Because I don't know what she knows, because she has studied it. So the advice that she can give me, or the advice that an actual, trained makeup artist could give me, is going to be something that I'm not aware of. So I'm going to ask for help if for some reason, not sure why, but if for some reason I needed to have my makeup done. And I see my role and the role of an editor as the same thing. It's teaching and guiding and showing better ways to do things and explaining those things. I'm moving a paragraph because could you add a little more clarity here? The reader won't necessarily understand this. Can you clarify that this is the name of the course that you did? Because I've Googled it and I can't find it. It's bits and pieces like that, and it is supportive. Particularly, I think, when we're working in heart-centered spaces, like many of the multi-author books appear to be, and I know yours are, and what you bring to your authors is more than just, hey, write a chapter, let's chuck it in a book. There's so much more.
So much more.
Yeah. So being part of that as an editor, it is important to explain why, and to help, and to also educate. And I guess this is something, it does come into the coaching work that I do, but I love helping clients with their blogs. I love to write people's blogs, but my favorite thing is if a client, because they know their business, and if they write their own blog and they send it to me, and then I go through it and I throw in some headings, and again, it's the same thing. There's structural editing and there's line editing in that as well. It's exactly the same process in a 500-word blog. And I send it back to them. I'll often have a 10-minute, 20-minute conversation with them to explain why I did what I did. Because then when they write their next blog, they might try and put headings in themselves, or they might try and structure it in the way that people read online, because they don't necessarily know that before they start working with me or another editor. So they are learning, they are polishing their skills, and ideally, it's not quite the same in chapter books, but for blogs with the clients, ideally, they won't need me in the future because they know how to do it themselves, and they're confident to portray their business in the way that they want to. And all of that is so important because it's empowering, and it's learning, and it's being more confident in sharing their voice or sharing their message. And I believe that that's what we want to do for for the people we'll be working with now and in the future. I don't even know if I answered your question there.
No, that was perfect. No, I loved everything about that, because there are so many layers to it, and it isn't just a simple process. It might seem like it, but there is a fine line. And I love the way that you talk about how asking questions and educating. And so Erin, who was with us last week, who we were talking about traditional publishing and why you'd want a publishing deal. I worked with Erin back in 2020, and I've really enjoyed working with Erin before. And she was very much the same as you, where when she was going through and editing the manuscript that I was ghostwriting, she would put questions in. Sometimes they were questions for me, sometimes they were questions for the actual author, because it was, we need more information here, or maybe we, do you really want to name and shame that person? Are you sure you want to go there? And little things like that really, it takes care and understanding to help shepherd the author through the process to make sure that the final product is the best possible piece. And so here I would really love to segue a little bit away from the editing side of things and more to the book coaching, because I know that's something that you do. You have helped a couple of the girls in our Lunar Wisdom book container. And I know that you've also, that was actually how you discovered collaborative books in the first place, because
Yes.
one of your mentors was actually participating in a multi-author book and was looking for some assistance. So I would love it if perhaps you would touch on a little bit why hiring a book coach can actually be a critical part of bringing sparkle to your manuscript before you even submit it to the
Yes.
editing process.
Yeah. So yes, I did work with one of my mentors. She's an amazing, lovely lady. And we have actually worked together. I have worked with her in her business, and she has worked with me through some copywriting. But she decided she was going to write a chapter in a multi-author book. Part of the reason I have worked with her in the past from a copywriting website creating perspective is that she has some massive blocks around writing. She she has some amazing stories to tell and a lot of wisdom to share with the world. But when it physically comes to pen to paper or hands on a keyboard, she can't do it. She freezes, and I find that with a lot of people. And there's a lot of different reasons why we have blocks. And you probably have your own blocks, and I have my own blocks. And I guess that's one of the things that really drew me to coaching people through the writing process, because blocks exist in all areas of our lives. But if you're working with someone one on one, or potentially in a group setting where they are holding your hand, and I love the use of the word shepherding, Jenny, Tracey, that you used before.
It's okay. We're
Sorry,
totally the same
it's
person,
early.
right? Like,
Yes,
it doesn't
pretend
matter. Jenny, we
oh,
love you. We miss
yes,
you.
you
We
do.
wish you were
She's here in
here.
spirit. Um,
She's
oh
on a
Lord,
beach, actually. She's in Hawaii. I'm just
I know. I
saying.
saw.
Under a
It
palm
looked amazing.
tree. So
Beautiful.
jealous.
Um. Anyway, Tracy. Um. Yeah. So anyway, long story, but she the way that we work together, and it is different for every single person, and this is where I draw in guidance from spirit. It's a very energetic working relationship, even through Zoom. That's fine. um, but the way that we worked is because her issue was actually pen to paper. She talked it out. We did 4 sessions, I think, over 4 weeks, about an hour and a half each. Sometimes I went a little bit longer. And she talked out what she wanted to say and the things that she wanted to convey, and they were some deep things, um, some really heartfelt parts of her story, and some of them were really difficult for her to express because they were a couple of traumatic events in her life as well. And that's one of the interesting things about working with someone from a coaching perspective of their writing is sometimes there's tears. There are healing moments, and as the person working with them, I have to hold space for that, and I love to do that. I'm getting teary even thinking about it because those tears, that healing, the breakthroughs that people have are simply amazing. Um, so we literally had, I think she had a 3,000 word chapter, and by the end of her talking out everything, I think we had close to 7,000 words, and that's where it came to me going, okay, well, between this session and the next session, I think it took us 2 to get it all out. I'm going to do some editing in the background, and I worked through it. I knew what her important points were, so I worked through it and did the structural stuff in between our sessions. So when it came to the next one, those questions that we were talking about before of, hey, this doesn't quite make sense, or we need more information here, or you've got 3 separate stories here, so we need to flow from this to this. How do we make it flow and not go, here's a story, here's a story, here's a story? We need to tie this together. How did you feel at this moment in time? Because we haven't got to that depth of feeling. And we literally worked our way through it, and we changed the structure a couple of times as well. And then by her 4th session, or just before the 4th session, it was, okay, I need you to look at the conclusion. I want you to write the conclusion. Give it a go. I don't care if it's bullet points, if there's half-finished sentences, if you're not sure what word to use, put in question marks. Like, it's okay, but this is your story. You've got your introduction. You've worked through it. You write the conclusion, and then I'll work with you to make it sparkle, as you said before.
Mm-hmm.
And it is magical. It is absolutely a magical experience. And it was easy. Like, yes, there was some tears. Yes, there was some stuff that came up. But working together like that, as opposed to you write your chapter and then give it to me and then I'll give it back and then you give it back. Spending those, what would it have been, 6 hours together, which is not a huge amount of time, was amazing. And her chapter, I'm actually more proud of it than the current chapter I'm writing because I haven't got to that finished thing. Yes, not for Lunar Wisdom, but for another book I'm part of. It, like, I'm so proud of it. It was like my own baby, as well as, well, it was her baby, so maybe it was my niece. But I don't know, it was just such an amazing process, and
I think you were the
it
fairy
made me realize,
godmother.
yeah, sprinkling magic, pixie dust. Yeah, it was such a beautiful experience, and so then working with some of the ladies through Lunar Wisdom is a different experience. One of the ladies that I worked with was not, she had written her chapter and it was an amazing chapter, but she didn't believe it was. So working with her again, doing the editing stuff, getting to know her, talking through it. It was a much shorter process. We didn't need 4 weeks. We did it in one session. There's a level of accountability there as well. When you're blocked with something, it's really easy to put it off. We all know that. Like, you can procrastinate till the cows come home. So in the case of the first person, and both of them, we worked together, and then it was, this is what I'm going to do. What are your actions? These are the actions, the 3 things that you need to do before we talk again or before you submit your chapter. So it's clarity for them. Yeah.
And I would also just like to interject here, just to carry on from this story, that the lady that Ruth worked with in Lunar Wisdom, when she submitted her chapter to the editing team, they read through it and they were like, this is perfect. It doesn't need a single thing done to it, because Ruth had already done that. So, that is when we talk about polishing it to a sparkle, working with somebody with a background in editing, particularly in developmental editing, but that also has the skills to pull out the best in your story, can be the difference between, and especially if you are self-publishing, for example, and you really want to make sure that you are not having to then waste a lot of money through the editing process by having to hire a developmental editor and then hire a copy editor or a line editor, or keep sending it back to the same person for each of the different processes. If you're working with a book coach who has those skills, you are quite likely to be able to cut out a lot of the drama in the process as you go through. And I think that can be really powerful. And for those of you out there who are thinking that book coaching is only something that happens with new authors, I would just like to say that Denise Duffield Thomas, who I also talk about every single week because I love her, she just rewrote her book Chill and Prosper, which was formerly known as Chillpreneur. So she updated it with a bunch of case studies and updated it for the pandemic. Denise works with a book coach, and she's very open about the fact that she works with a book coach because she needs the accountability. Now, she is traditionally published, which means she is submitting her manuscript to a publisher who has teams of 3 to 5 editors who are going to go through it. And yet she still chooses to work with somebody privately on her own for the accountability, amongst other things, because it keeps her on track to write the chapters, to send the work through, to get the feedback, to fill in those plot holes, and to make sure that she's making it as tight as possible before she then submits the manuscript to her traditional publishing house, Hay House. And so it's not, and I mean, she's a 7-figure entrepreneur, right? It's not like this is something that is only for people who've never written books before. It doesn't even mean that it's only for people who have 7-figure businesses either. Like, book coaching or working with editors, your own editors through the self-publishing process and things like that, these are I believe, critical elements, which is one of the reasons that I am so passionate about including developmental editing in my book containers. And lucky for me, I have the best work wife in the world, and Jenny is very happy to go with me on that. And so with Wounded Women, this is one of the reasons we are so excited to be bringing Ruth on board, is because developmental editing is something that we want to include as standard in all of our book containers, because we really feel that it's important for every single woman who writes a chapter with us or who writes a solo book with us to be 100% confident that the chapter she is publishing is the best possible version of her words and her message, while still maintaining her authentic voice.
Yes.
And, you know, like this, to me, this is critical and this is pivotal. And I am, you know, Jenny and I are both making sure that this is something that we build in right from the beginning with the Women Writing Intentionally Collective. Like, we're making that conscious decision to set ourselves apart from the common model that is being practiced, because we think this is what makes good books. And that's why we are passionate about the Women Writing Intentionally Collective, because we're very intentional about all of the things.
And I guess that's the point, is that as an author, as a writer, there's two things. What I was thinking as you were talking before, Tracey, is that it can be lonely, particularly if you are writing things that are difficult, or you know, in the space of these where people are writing about life-changing experiences. It can be lonely, it can be scary. So having someone to give you that confidence, whether it's within the book container or working with someone externally as well, is really, really important. Like, it is empowering, and it is, so you're presenting your best work. And now my brain has forgotten what number 2 was. What were we talking about? It's gone.
We were talking about intentionality and building it into book containers.
Yep, we were. And it's completely gone out of my
It's okay. We'll come back to it if it comes
back to it. Yes. It
We'll
obviously
circle
wasn't
back
meant to be
later.
said at a particular moment.
No.
Yes, there was confidence. And yeah, I think that the other part of all of that, which is something that you mentioned earlier, but comes into it, is that when we are sharing things that are deep, or particularly if it gets to the stage where people are talking about potential abuse that they've suffered, or addictions, or things like that that have led them to life-changing experiences, or they've worked through alcoholism or whatever, like things that have dramatically impacted their life, it can be really difficult to write about that without naming names. And they might not want to name names or say this happened in a particular family situation or whatever. And there are ways, and I have worked with people in the past with this, there are ways to structure so you can still explain what happened, but in a way that you're comfortable with and isn't accusatory or potentially setting you up for a family implosion, or having, you know, someone actually legally coming towards you and saying, hey, you can't say that about me because it's, you know, you can allege what you want, but it's not true. Like, it can get into difficult things when people are delving into their really deep things. So working with someone who, in your containers, who care, for starters, and will also guide them through that process, so that when they put that chapter out into the world, they're not terrified of it. They're proud of it. They're confident. They know that they've expressed what they need to with grace and mercy and compassion. That's really important. So yes, that was something you mentioned earlier, but it's come back through as something we need to bring up now. Because that fear can cripple you as a writer, and stop you from sharing your story with the world. And that story potentially needs to be heard. And if you believe it needs to be heard, then you can do it. But sometimes you just need someone to hold your hand and guide you in the right direction to do that.
So much, so much. That's one of the reasons, particularly with the Wounded Women series, that we feel very
Mm,
strongly about this,
yep.
because these are stories of vulnerability. These are stories of
Mm,
transformation. These are stories that most likely have a lot of pain, and a lot of
mm-hmm.
fear, even a lot of trauma. And we really wanted to make sure that we were going to be really sensitive and hold energetic space for the women who are coming in to share their stories of betrayal and generational trauma,
Yep.
or like breaking ancestral chains, and also dealing with
Mm-hmm.
things like the witch wound and speaking their truth and breaking away from societal expectations. Like, these are pieces that have been so deeply ingrained into us with fear, for a
Yep.
start. And that can bring up a lot during the writing process, but then also as we move through the publishing process as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the reasons that we do feel like we need to be very sensitive to how that process is managed, both not
Mm,
just from an editing and not just from a book coaching point of view, but also in terms of how we are guiding our authors in terms of how and where they want to show up in the world, and working through their visibility blocks and through their confidence blocks and through all of those things, but providing that safety and support. Because that, when you have that kind of support, when you're in those containers where you feel loved and cared for and supported, it is not only transformational from the point
so
of view
important.
of revisiting your own stories and choosing to perceive them from a different perspective, but also the support can be transformational in and of itself, especially when we're dealing with things like the sister wound, which is what we're covering in the first book, Betrayed. When you are surrounded by that community of strong women who are
Mm-hmm.
also going through the same journeys, it is literally breaking down things like the sister wound. And
Yep.
it is, this whole process of creating the Women Writing Intentionally collective even was designed to help facilitate a space where women could come together without fear of judgment or criticism or betrayal, and
Yeah.
be amongst a supportive group of like-minded women. So,
Mm,
these are the things that I think really matter. And
yeah.
I'm thrilled that all of the women that have been coming into our containers and into our spaces seem to resonate and vibe with that. And I know
Mm,
I'm very confident that I can speak for Jenny on this as well, that we are so thrilled to have you coming on board with us for Wounded Women,
thanks.
because I know that our authors, our future authors, who I don't know who they are going to be yet, because we haven't officially opened the doors yet. We're doing that when Jenny gets back from Hawaii, which is in another day or two. So if you are watching and you think you've got a story about the sister wound, do feel free, slide into my DMs, slide into Jenny's DMs or whatever, leave a comment for us. But that is something that we are really looking at,
Mm,
as we move through, because I think that these are the stories that also need to be told to help us
yep.
shift the societal pressure as well, because the
Mm,
business paradigms are changing, and women need to be having these conversations. Women need to be sharing their experiences. It's exactly what you were saying before about how so many women authors feel like their stories aren't good enough, or they feel like they don't
mm,
have anything important to say, but that actually the truth is that there is probably a woman out there who desperately needs to hear that,
mm-hmm.
because she needs hope that her
Yep.
situation might change.
And the thing about writing and producing books like this, particularly multi-author ones, the beauty of what I see in them is that there might be, anywhere between 12 to 20 stories in a book. And I might read three of those chapters and go, oh, that's interesting. And then the fourth one will have me in tears, or I can relate, or I've learned something from this. Um, and what I see the beauty of them as being is that people will who read them will get or hear or feel or resonate with, whatever words you want to use, what they need to from it. And that was described to me once um, as a light coded thing. That, I might write something and you'll get something from it, and Jenny will get something different from it. And if my daughter reads it, she'll get something different from it, because we've all had different life experiences, or we're all needing to hear a particularly different message at that time. Um,
Mhm.
and as far as, as it's very general, but as far as women, our voices have been quietened for such a long time. And it is, um, there are some women who can step into the space and go, hear me roar, just can do that. There are other women, I guess, like Jenny's recent book, the Quiet and Badass book. There are other women who can't do that. I'm one of them. Like, I find it really hard to get up there and go, this is what I want to say. Learning, but it's been a long process. But being able to speak what you want to speak and process what you need to process. And I think in my bio, I'm not sure now, but it says something about the art of storytelling. And that is the thing for me. Human beings have told stories forever. It is how wisdom is passed on. It's how lessons are passed on. It's how warnings are passed on. Women stopped being able to share those stories, which is a whole other conversation for another day. But we became quiet because we were told our stories weren't important, generally speaking.
And it
But
wasn't
we
safe to
are.
share them because
No, but our wisdom and what we can pass on to future generations of boys and girls. I'm a mum of 2 boys and 2 girls. So, yes, I work predominantly with women, but I also talk a lot to as much to my boys as to my girls about society and women's
Mhm.
voices and men's voices, because these young people coming through are having their own struggles as well, male or female, or any gender fluidity within
Yeah.
there. Um,
No,
so yeah,
100% agree, because
fascinating.
I've got a son and a daughter as well, and
Mm,
while I do very obviously, clearly choose to work predominantly with women, it is something that I feel like the conversations at home still need to be facilitated, and also that my son needs to feel safe in his spaces as well, that his voice
yes,
matters, that it's not just a case of, well, his sister's voice matters more than his voice.
yes, absolutely.
So yeah,
Mm,
like that balance between the masculine and feminine is
yeah,
important. Um, but yeah, these things,
mm,
they do need to be talked about, and women's voices do need to be amplified.
mm.
And that's one of the reasons that I
They
started
do.
Gender Moon Press, because I wanted to be able to amplify the voices of the safekeepers of sacred wisdom.
Yeah. And working in this space, I see it as an honor and a privilege. For me, it's not about the money, it's not about the business success or any of those sorts of things. Helping someone to tell their story, or like I said before, to work through their stuff in the telling of their story, and then be able to share that and not only transform their view or their life, but also help other people do that. It's a beautiful process, and it is absolutely an honor to be involved in that. Yeah, I love it.
Yes,
Um,
oh, I'm so glad. And so I'm so excited to have you in our spaces. I think that when we meet our soul families and our like-minded sisters, it
yeah,
is always a joy and a privilege
beautiful.
to walk this journey together,
Mm,
because as we do
it is.
that, our voices amplify more than just the sum of each individual part.
Yeah.
You know, we create that tidal wave of change. So, for those of you who might be watching us today, if you are not a member of our Women Writing Intentionally Collective Facebook group, please feel free. The address is just in the comments below, or in the ticker tape there, and you can come and join us. If you'd like to connect with Ruth and find out a little bit more about her editing services or her book coaching, because you've got a manuscript coming up or you've got a chapter in a multi-author book, please do come and join us in the collective and hit her up for her services. They are listed in our business directory. and you can come and hang out with other like-minded women writers and women who work in the publishing industry supporting women writers, and really, like, hang out in the best place on the internet as far as I'm concerned. But come and
Yeah.
hang out with us, like, be part of our tribe. We're friendly. We don't bite unless you
You
ask
are.
nicely.
And I've learned a lot from listening to these conversations, like yours and Jenny's and the other guests that you've had on. I've learned so much from that. And I think that's one of the beauties about it is there's room for the questions and communication and vulnerability, and there's so much learning and wisdom in there as well. I'm thoroughly enjoying being part of this group. I think it's amazing. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us. So I know that we've got somebody here who says that it's
Yeah.
still not safe for them to share their story. I'm not sure exactly who you are. I will be checking on Facebook after the thing. I would love to speak with you. I know sometimes we do have stories that are, especially when we're still in the thick of things, don't feel like they're safe to share. But as Ruth was saying, sometimes there are ways and means that we can still share the parts that need to be shared without sharing all of the details
Mm.
and putting ourselves at risk. But even if you aren't feeling like it is safe for you to share your story, please do feel free to come and join our community and allow us to support you until you do feel
Yeah.
safe to share your story, because we
Yeah.
would love to hold that energetic space for you.
And there's also healing in writing it down or speaking it. You can run the new what do you call it, dictation part of Word now. Sometimes writing it down, journaling it, whatever, even if you have no intention of sharing it, that can be a healing process as well. If it's a tough one, and get your tissues and make sure that you've got whatever support you need, whether it's psychological, whether it's a friend, whether it's a mental health practitioner, whatever it is that you need. But I have books and books and books of stuff that I've written that has not seen the light of day. Maybe it will when the time's right. But it's incredibly healing and cathartic to get that stuff out of your head and out of your heart as well.
Mhm.
Just make sure you're safe when you do it.
That's a really great point, and this is something that has come up in the Lunar Wisdom container as well, that sometimes the things that need to be written and sometimes the things that need to come out as part of the writing process aren't necessarily the pieces that need to be published in this particular container. So I know that there was at least one of my authors, in fact, I feel like there were 2 or 3, in fact, who had parts of their story that needed to be written, but actually they weren't part of their Lunar Wisdom chapters. But it was because it was all
Yeah.
bubbling up at the same time. And none of that work is ever wasted, right? Like none of those words, even if you type them up and don't use them for a particular chapter or for a particular book, doesn't mean they're wasted. You can keep them in a Word document. You can keep them, if you've got Scrivener or something like that, keep them into a little snippets folder. If you use a journal, you can keep them written down in a journal and have those there and available for you to come back to at some point in the future when you are ready, when perhaps maybe you have a resolution to the story, or when you are feeling safer or stronger, or like the opportunity, the right book comes along. Because sometimes that happens too. Sometimes it's not the right book and it's not the right time and it's not the right place. And when that opportunity does come up and you're like, oh, I have the perfect story for this. So,
I
there are
spoke
lots
to
of
a
reasons.
I spoke to a lovely lady. It's actually at a networking thing a little while ago. And she's already published 2 books and been part of a multi-author book as well. And her background story, like her childhood, was difficult, traumatic, and some awful crap happened. And when she wrote her first book, that came into it. And the editor that she worked with at the time, she was telling me at this networking thing, said, I want you to go into specifics. Your readers need to hear it. Now, she wasn't comfortable sharing those specifics for a variety of reasons, which she did explain, but that's her story to tell. But she had her reasons for not going into it. And the argument literally came down to between her and her editor at the time that when we watch TV and whatever, there is gratuitous stuff. Like everything is spelt out for us, and you see the bad crap happen. She didn't want to bring that energy into her book. She also didn't want to go into those details, as I said, for her reasons. So she stuck to her guns, and she said, because the editor was saying the reader needs to see it, the reader needs to understand, they need to know specifics. I've read her book, it's beautiful. She touches on significant trauma in a paragraph and then moves through it. And yes, it's left to your imagination. I read it and just wanted to give her a big, massive cuddle. It didn't need that. And if she was not comfortable to share that for whatever reasons she has, that's fine. You don't owe your reader anything. And that I found that, like I said, that was just earlier this year, but I found that as an editor, a really important thing to remember, particularly when someone is writing about trauma.
Yes.
Only share what is comfortable.
And there are ways to handle it sensitively. I'd just like to give a shout out to my client, Carolyn, who was actually leaving comments for us earlier. She's just ducked off because her first collaborative book, Beautifully Broken, was released today. And she got chapter 1 in that book. So she's the lead author for that one. But she also has her solo book coming out next month called From a Place Called Shame. And she touches on a number of really sensitive issues. It's the story of her life. It's, it's part of a memoir. And she discusses, being in relationships where she struggled with, post-traumatic stress as a result of a sexual assault. But the actual assault, she handled it so gently and carefully, because circling back to what you were saying earlier about writing from the reader's perspective, she really wanted to make sure that as she was telling her story, what she was doing was helping other women who may be in a similar situation to what she had been in, to feel like she was there walking alongside them, holding their hand, or that they were feeling supported as well. So she was very conscious of that. And she handled so many of these delicate topics with such grace and such beauty. And I was privileged enough to be able to be one of her advanced readers. So I have read it, even though it doesn't come out until next month. But she did a marvelous job. And so there are ways that these things can be handled with sensitivity, without having to put it all out there in explicit detail. It doesn't have to be an erotic novel. I'm just saying it can. That's a whole different niche, and I'm not throwing shade on erotica by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying that we don't always have to go into explicit detail.
Yes, exactly.
So, okay. Well, for those of you who have been listening tonight, I hope you've really enjoyed discovering more about developmental and structural editing. If you do have any questions about that, do make sure that you drop them in the comments, Ruth, and I will be able to come back to those. If you would like to find out more about book coaching or anything like that, please do come and join us in the Women Writing Intentionally Collective Facebook group, where you can also connect with Ruth. If you would like to, you can join the conversation with us. You can be safe, held, and supported. And we will also have Jenny back next week. I'm going to be so excited to see her face again. She's never allowed to go on vacation again. I'm just saying.
Unless it's with you.
Yeah. She's only ever allowed to go on vacation with me from now on. Writing retreats, totally going to happen in 2023. I'm just giving you guys all a heads up now. I know, so exciting. But Yeah, so I'll have Jenny back with us next week. I'm not sure what we're going to be talking about yet because we haven't really had a chance to touch base while she's been away. But Ruth, we are so thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for filling in and being my substitute work
You're
wife
welcome.
tonight.
Well, it's early in the morning. Well, not early. It's what is it, 9:15 in the morning with me, but you're welcome.
And yeah, so it has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope everybody has found it educational and that there is, something valuable for you to take away with us today. So, Ruth, do you have any final messages you want to share with anybody?
Well, all the talks of, blocks and putting pen to paper and all the rest of it. I think it is really important that if you feel you have something to say, whether it's going out into the world or it's not, but there's something in your heart or in your head or both in your soul that needs to come out, write it. That is my biggest piece of advice. And even from an editing perspective, Tracey's heard me say this 1,000 times, just write. Don't edit, don't question, don't look at what you're doing, don't read it back with judgment or anything like that. Literally get it out of your heart, get it out of your head. And that process is absolutely amazing from so many levels. And as Tracey said, you never know where you're going to be able to use it.
Exactly. I very strongly believe this. This is something that I've been doing with my coaching clients for several years in a number of activities where we just do that brain dump where you write without judgment and then you work it out later. But once you've got it all out. So excellent advice, Ruth. Thank you for the reminder so that everybody can, get out there and put pen to paper and make beautiful things happen. So thanks everybody for being Yes, share our wisdom. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us again for another episode of the Women Writing Intentionally show. We will be back again next Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific and 11 p.m. Central Europe, which is then also 8 a.m. Australian
8
time?
a.m. Australia.
8 a.m. Australia. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again next